September afternoon hung over St. Mary Mead like a watercolour painting left slightly damp, all soft edges and gentle hues. The annual parish fete spread across the vicarage lawn with the comfortable disorder of a tradition that had repeated itself for generations. Bunting fluttered between the elm trees, tea urns steamed on checkered tablecloths, and the familiar voices of the village mingled in that particular harmony of shared purpose and gentle gossip. Miss Jane Marple sat in her customary chair beneath the old apple tree, her knitting needles moving with practised rhythm, while her sharp blue eyes took in the scene before her. At 75, she had learned that the best way to observe human nature was to become part of the furniture, present but unnoticed, available for confidences but never demanding them. The historical display. This year's fete featured something special, a historical display centred around the ancient parish chest, which had been brought from the church vestry and positioned on a small platform near the tea tent. The chest itself was a magnificent piece of medieval craftsmanship, its oak surface darkened with age and carved with intricate religious symbols. 3 elaborate locks secured its contents, traditionally requiring the vicar, churchwarden and verger to be present for any opening. Mr. Arthur Pemberton, the churchwarden, stood proudly beside the chest, explaining its significance to a small gathered crowd. He was a thin, precise man in his 60s, whose devotion to the church's historical artifacts bordered on obsession. Today, however, his usual composure seemed slightly strained, and Miss Marple noticed how his fingers worried at the ring of ancient keys in his hand. "The chest hasn't been properly examined in decades," he was explaining to Mrs. Dolly Bantry and Colonel Melchett. "When we decided to clean the vestry thoroughly, I thought it might be interesting to catalogue its contents for the Historical Society." The mysterious letter. The crowd grew as Mr. Pemberton, with ceremonial flourish, inserted the 3 keys and opened the heavy lid. The interior revealed the expected treasures, ancient service books, tarnished silver vessels, and bundles of documents tied with faded ribbon. But it was the discovery of a single, relatively modern envelope that caused the first stir of genuine interest. The envelope was of good quality paper, cream-coloured, and bearing the letterhead of a London law firm. It was sealed with red wax and addressed in a firm hand. "To be opened only upon the death of A.G., Parish of St. Mary Mead." "How very intriguing," murmured Mrs. Griselda Clement, the vicar's wife, peering over the shoulders of the taller spectators. "A G? Does anyone know who that might refer to?" Miss Marple's needles paused almost imperceptibly. In her experience, mysterious letters hidden in church chests rarely contained pleasant surprises. She watched the faces around the display with particular attention, noting Mrs. Price Ridley's sharp intake of breath, the way Colonel Melchett's military bearing stiffened slightly, and most interestingly, the sudden pallor that crossed the features of Mr. Gerald Finch. The antique dealer's interest, Mr. Gerald Finch was a recent arrival to the village, having purchased the old rectory 6 months prior, and established himself as an antique dealer. He was a man of perhaps 50, with carefully styled silver hair and an eye for valuable objects that had quickly made him both respected and slightly resented in equal measure. His interest in the mysterious letter seemed far more intense than mere curiosity would warrant. "Perhaps," he suggested with studied casualness, "the letter should be examined by someone with experience in historical documents. I'd be happy to offer my expertise." "That's very kind," replied the Reverend Leonard Clement, "but I think such matters should remain within the church family for now." Miss Marple observed the brief flash of frustration that crossed Mr. Finch's features before his practised smile returned. She also noted that Mrs. Jennifer Fortescue, who helped with the church accounts, had moved closer to the chest and was studying the envelope with unusual intensity. The fatal discovery. The afternoon progressed with the usual fete activities, but Miss Marple noticed that several people kept glancing toward the parish chest. The mysterious letter had clearly stirred something in the peaceful waters of village life. As the shadows began to lengthen and the crowd started to thin, she decided to take a closer look at the historical display herself. What she found there would transform the gentle parish fete into something far more sinister. The parish chest stood open, its ancient contents scattered. But now, crumpled among the old documents and silver vessels, was the body of Mr. Gerald Finch. His silver hair was dishevelled, his face was an alarming shade of blue, and around his neck was wrapped one of the old ribbon ties from the document bundles, pulled tight with deadly efficiency. The mysterious letter was nowhere to be seen. Miss Marple stood quietly for a moment, her trained eye taking in the scene. The killer had been clever, using the confusion of the fate and the natural cover of the chest platform to commit murder virtually in plain sight. But cleverness, she had learned, often contained the seeds of its own undoing. The investigation begins. "Mrs. Clement," she called calmly to the vicar's wife. "I'm afraid we have a situation here that requires immediate attention." Within minutes, the peaceful fete had transformed into a scene of controlled chaos. Dr. Haydock arrived to confirm what was already evident. Inspector Slack was summoned from the village, and the remaining fete-goers found themselves reluctant witnesses to murder. As the official investigation began, Miss Marple settled back into her chair with her knitting, her mind already working on the puzzle before her. Someone had wanted that letter badly enough to kill for it. Someone who had been present at the fete, who had access to the chest, and who had known exactly what that envelope contained. The question was not just who had committed the murder, but what secret from the past was worth killing to protect. In Miss Marple's experience, the most dangerous secrets were often those that appeared most innocent on the surface. She picked up her knitting needles and resumed their gentle clicking. There was much to observe, much to consider, and a killer to catch. The parish fete was over, but Miss Marple's work was just beginning. The news spread through St. Mary Mead with the peculiar velocity that only village tragedy could achieve. Within an hour of the discovery, the peaceful fete had transformed into a scene of controlled chaos, with Inspector Slack's arrival bringing the sharp efficiency of official investigation to what had been a gentle afternoon gathering. Miss Marple remained in her chair beneath the apple tree, her knitting needles moving with practised rhythm, while her sharp eyes observed the unfolding drama. She had learned long ago that people revealed more of themselves in moments of crisis than in years of ordinary conversation, and this afternoon was proving particularly illuminating. The official investigation, Inspector Slack, brisk and purposeful, had quickly established the basic facts. "Death occurred between 4:40 and 5:10 this afternoon," he announced to the assembled crowd. "Strangulation by one of those old ribbon ties from the documents. The missing letter is our primary concern. Whoever took it likely killed for it." Dr. Haydock's examination had been characteristically blunt. "Quick work," he told Miss Marple quietly. "Whoever did this knew exactly what they were about. Not a crime of passion. This was planned, though the execution was opportunistic." The physician's words carried particular weight. In Miss Marple's experience, premeditated murders in small villages were often the most dangerous kind, born of long, festering resentments and carefully calculated desperation. Theories and suspicions. As the afternoon wore on and the official investigation continued, the villagers began to form their own theories about the crime. Mrs. Price Ridley, her angular frame rigid with indignation, was among the first to voice her opinion. "That man was clearly involved in some unsavoury business," she declared to anyone within hearing. "Antique dealers, we all know what that means. Mrs. Baker at the post office mentioned he'd been receiving foreign correspondence lately. Mark my words, this has nothing to do with our village. Some criminal associate from his past finally caught up with him." Miss Marple noted how Mrs. Price Ridley clutched her reticule protectively as she spoke, the same gesture she'd made when the mysterious letter was first discovered. In her experience, when people were eager to distance a crime from their community, they often had personal reasons for doing so. Colonel Melchett, arriving from Much Benham when news reached him, took a decidedly different view. "The timing's too convenient," he stated firmly. "Someone at this fete killed Finch, and it has everything to do with that letter. Those initials, a G, they meant something to someone here." His weathered face creased in concentration as he continued. "Augustus Greeley comes to mind. Had that trouble after the war, went off to London. Died in 1937, if memory serves. If that letter concerned him, it's been sitting in that chest for over a decade." Mrs. Dolly Bantry, ever inclined toward romantic drama, offered yet another perspective. "I think it was a crime of passion," she announced breathlessly. Gerald Finch was quite an attractive man, and several ladies had been paying him particular attention. Perhaps there was jealousy involved, a romantic entanglement gone wrong. Observing the observers. While the theories swirled around her, Miss Marple focused on the reactions of those present. Mrs. Jennifer Fortescue, the church treasurer, seemed particularly affected by the day's events. The usually composed woman appeared genuinely distressed, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke to Inspector Slack. "I keep thinking about that poor man," Mrs. Fortescue had said earlier. "And that letter, I can't help wondering what it contained. The initials A.G. meant nothing to me, of course." Miss Marple had noted the slight emphasis on "of course," and the way Mrs. Fortescue's eyes hadn't quite met hers when she said it. In her long experience, when people insisted too strongly that something meant nothing to them, it usually meant quite the opposite. Mr. Arthur Pemberton, the churchwarden, presented another study in distress. His usual meticulous demeanour had cracked entirely, and he kept running his hands through his sparse hair while muttering about the sanctity of the church being violated. His distress seemed genuine, but Miss Marple wondered if it stemmed entirely from the desecration of his beloved historical display, or if there were more personal concerns at play. Small details, large implications. As the crowd gradually dispersed and the police continued their work, Miss Marple noticed several small details that others had overlooked. Near where the parish chest had stood, she observed faint red crumbs that looked suspiciously like sealing wax. Someone had been very close to that letter when it was opened, close enough for fragments to fall on their clothing or hands. She also recalled Mrs. Fortescue's earlier behaviour, how the woman had moved closer to examine the envelope with unusual intensity. There had been something about her posture, the way she'd leaned forward, that suggested more than casual curiosity. The pattern emerges. As the September sun began to set and the last of the fête's remnants were cleared away, Miss Marple sat quietly in her garden, organising the day's observations. The murder weapon, an old ribbon from the chest itself, suggested intimate knowledge of the contents. The missing letter pointed to a motive rooted in the past, and the various reactions she'd witnessed indicated that several people in St. Mary Mead knew more about the mysterious A.G. than they were willing to admit. Tomorrow, she decided, she would pay a visit to the church records. In her experience, the past had a way of reaching into the present with deadly consequences, and that forgotten letter had clearly disturbed something that someone had been desperate to keep buried. The clicking of her knitting needles resumed in the gathering dusk as Miss Marple settled into her evening routine. But her mind remained active, sorting through the threads of human nature and hidden motive that would, in time, reveal the pattern of murder that had disrupted the peace of St. Mary Mead. The morning following the murder brought a deceptive calm to St. Mary Mead, the kind of stillness that settles over a village when shocking events have disrupted its natural rhythm. Miss Marple rose early, as was her custom, and after a quiet breakfast found herself drawn toward the village centre. In her long experience, the hours immediately following a crime often prove most revealing, when shock-loosened tongues and careful facades began to crack under pressure. Her first destination was the post office, where Mrs. Baker presided over the morning's mail with the keen attention of someone who understood that correspondence often revealed more than conversation. The small shop buzzed with subdued activity as villagers collected letters and shared their theories about the previous day's tragedy. "Such a dreadful business," Mrs. Baker was saying to Mrs. Clement as Miss Marple entered, selecting a packet of stamps she didn't particularly need. "That poor Mr. Finch seemed like such a gentleman, though I must say he'd been receiving some unusual correspondence lately." Miss Marple waited patiently, her knitting needles clicking softly in her basket as the conversation developed naturally. In her experience, rushing information rarely produced reliable results. "There was a registered letter just last week," Mrs. Baker continued, warming to her subject. "From a nursing home in Bournemouth, Seaside Manor," the return address read. The sender's initials were A.G., which seemed such a coincidence when we found that envelope yesterday. Made me wonder if someone was settling old business before. She left the implication hanging delicately in the air. Miss Marple's pulse quickened, though her expression remained serenely interested. A registered letter from A.G. to Gerald Finch, arriving just days before the fete. This was no mere coincidence. Leaving the post office, she encountered the Reverend Clement emerging from the church, his usually cheerful demeanour clouded with concern. "Miss Marple, good morning. I've been going through the old vestry records trying to understand this business with the initials A.G. "And what did you discover?" she inquired gently. "There's an entry from 1930, he replied, producing a leather-bound ledger. A letter was deposited in the Parish Chest by one A.G., witnessed by the then verger, a gudgeon. The entry notes it was to be opened only upon A.G.'s death." He paused, frowning. "But there's also a notation from 1937. A.G. departed parish under difficult circumstances. Letter custody confirmed." The pieces were beginning to form a pattern. Miss Marple thanked the vicar and continued her morning walk, directing her steps toward the cottage where Mrs. Jennifer Fortescue lived. She found the church treasurer in her garden, ostensibly tending to late roses, but clearly distracted. "Mrs. Fortescue," Miss Marple called over the garden gate, "I hope you're feeling better after yesterday's shock." The younger woman looked up, and Miss Marple noted the telltale signs of a sleepless night, the careful application of powder that couldn't quite conceal her pallor, the slight tremor in her hands. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to ask. Please, do come in." The invitation seemed reluctant, but Miss Marple accepted graciously, finding herself seated in the spotless kitchen where church financial records lay spread across the table. "I've been reviewing the accounts," Mrs. Fortescue explained, though her hands moved protectively over the documents. "After yesterday's events, I thought it best to ensure everything was in order." Miss Marple's experienced eye caught sight of several papers bearing signatures and dates from the 1930s before Mrs. Fortescue gathered them up. It must be challenging work dealing with historical records. Sometimes old irregularities come to light, don't they? Mrs. Fortescue's reaction was immediate and telling. Her hands stilled completely and colour rose in her cheeks. "I wouldn't know about any irregularities." The church's finances have always been properly managed, but Miss Marple remembered clearly seeing Mrs. Fortescue in earnest conversation with Gerald Finch at the church garden party just 2 weeks prior. The woman was being less than truthful. Her next encounter was with Mr. Arthur Pemberton, whom she found in his garden, attacking the deadheading of his roses with unusual vigour. The churchwarden looked haggard, his normally immaculate appearance dishevelled. "Mr. Pemberton," she greeted him gently, "you mustn't blame yourself for what happened." He looked up, his face creased with worry. "But I do, Miss Marple. If I hadn't insisted on displaying the chest— The truth is, mister, Finch had been pressing me about it for weeks, kept asking about old families in the village, particularly anyone with the initials A.G. He claimed to be researching historical connections for the antique trade, but his interest seemed far too personal for mere professional curiosity. Did he mention anything specific about what he was seeking? Pemberton's pruning shears snapped through a stem with unnecessary force. He spoke of family documents, old financial records. There was something about Augustus Greeley. You remember, the man who left the village in 1937 after that unpleasant business with the church building fund. Finch seemed to know more about that affair than he should have, considering he'd only recently arrived in the village. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The financial scandal involving Augustus Greeley was beginning to take shape as the central thread connecting past and present. "And you're certain Mr. Finch had no legitimate claim to such information?" "None that I could determine," Pemberton replied, though he did mention having a client interested in genealogical research. "Said there might be considerable value in certain family papers. I thought it sounded rather far-fetched myself." As she walked home through the village green, Miss Marple reflected on the morning's discoveries. The pattern was becoming clearer with each conversation. Augustus Greeley, who had left St. Mary Mead in disgrace after financial irregularities involving church funds, had recently been in correspondence with Gerald Finch from a nursing home. The mysterious letter in the parish chest had been deposited by Greeley himself, witnessed and secured for decades. Mrs. Fortescue's nervous behaviour and her access to church financial records suggested she knew more about the historical scandal than she admitted. Her defensive reactions indicated personal involvement, beyond mere professional duty. Gerald Finch had not been a casual antique dealer, stumbling upon an interesting historical artifact. He had come to St. Mary Mead with specific knowledge and purpose, seeking something valuable enough to justify weeks of careful investigation and ultimately worth killing for. The missing letter, Miss Marple was now certain, contained information that could destroy someone's carefully constructed life. Whether it documented financial fraud, revealed hidden relationships, or exposed other buried secrets, it represented a threat significant enough to drive someone to murder. As she reached her cottage gate, Miss Marple noticed Inspector Slack approaching from the direction of the church, his expression grimly purposeful. The official investigation was clearly uncovering its own threads of evidence, and she suspected that the careful balance of secrets in St. Mary Mead was about to shift dramatically. The afternoon promised to bring new revelations, and Miss Marple settled into her chair with her knitting, her mind already working on the connections between past scandal and present murder. In her experience, the most dangerous secrets were those that bridged generations, and Augustus Greeley's letter had clearly cast a very long shadow. Indeed, Inspector Slack arrived at Miss Marple's cottage gate with the purposeful stride of a man who believed he had solved his case. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across her garden as she invited him in for tea, noting the satisfaction in his bearing that spoke of conclusions reached and arrests pending. "I thought you'd want to hear the latest developments, Miss Marple," he announced, settling into the offered chair with evident pleasure. "We've made considerable progress, and I expect to have this matter wrapped up by tomorrow evening." Miss Marple poured tea with her customary care, though her keen eyes studied the inspector's confident demeanour. In her long experience, when officials spoke with such certainty so early in an investigation, they often overlooked crucial subtleties in their eagerness to close a case. How gratifying, Inspector. I'm sure the village will be relieved to have the uncertainty resolved. Slack accepted his cup and leaned forward conspiratorially. The evidence points clearly to Mrs. Jennifer Fortescue. She had motive, opportunity, and we've found physical evidence linking her directly to the crime. Indeed? Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm. What sort of evidence? Fragments of red sealing wax on her kitchen table and traces under her fingernails, Slack replied triumphantly. She clearly opened that letter before disposing of it. We also found a piece of ribbon in her sewing basket, with a frayed end that matches the murder weapon. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The physical evidence was certainly damning, yet something about its obviousness troubled her understanding of human nature. And the motive? Family scandal, Slack continued with the satisfaction of a puzzle solver. Mrs. Fortescue's maiden name was Greeley. She's Augustus Greeley's niece. That letter contained documentation about the old church building fund irregularities from the 1930s. Finch was using it to blackmail her, threatening to expose the family connection and destroy her reputation in the village. The inspector pulled out his notebook, consulting his carefully recorded facts. She admits to meeting with Finch privately several times over the past month. Claims he was pressuring her about old family papers, demanding information about her uncle's activities. Mrs. Price Ridley witnessed one of these meetings, saw Mrs. Fortescue leaving Finch's cottage in obvious distress 3 evenings ago. Miss Marple sipped her tea delicately. And she acknowledges these meetings? Initially denied them, but when confronted with witness testimony, she broke down and confessed. Said Finch had been threatening to publish his research about the Greeley scandal unless she provided him with additional church records. She was terrified of the shame it would bring to her family name. The timing is curious, Miss Marple observed gently. If Mr. Finch had been pressuring her for a month, why choose to act during the parish fete with the entire village present? Slack waved dismissively. Perfect cover, actually. The confusion of the event allowed her to approach the chest without suspicion, commit the crime quickly, and blend back into the crowd. She had access to the ribbons, knew the chest's contents, and the chaos provided ideal camouflage. Miss Marple's needles paused almost imperceptibly. And yet, if she feared exposure of the letter's contents, wouldn't she have tried to prevent the chest being opened at all? As church treasurer, she surely had influence over such decisions. Criminal panic, Slack replied firmly. Once Pemberton insisted on the display, She realized her only chance was to get that letter before anyone else could read it. When Finch showed unusual interest in it, she knew he'd recognized its significance. The inspector finished his tea and prepared to leave, clearly satisfied with his logical reconstruction of events. We'll be bringing her in for formal questioning tomorrow morning. The case is quite straightforward. Family shame, blackmail, and a desperate woman driven to murder. After Slack's departure, Miss Marple sat quietly in her garden, organizing the day's revelations. The case against Mrs. Fortescue was certainly compelling on its surface. She possessed motive, opportunity, and physical evidence linked her to the crime. Yet several elements didn't align with Miss Marple's observations of human behaviour. Mrs. Fortescue's nervousness could indeed indicate guilt, but it could equally suggest fear of someone else's actions. A woman truly guilty of premeditated murder would likely have been more careful about disposing of incriminating evidence like sealing wax fragments. The admission of meetings with Finch, once confronted, suggested someone more concerned with truth than concealment. Most tellingly, Mrs. Fortescue's character didn't fit the crime's execution. The murder had been swift, decisive, and coldly efficient, requiring a detachment that seemed inconsistent with the anxious, meticulous woman Miss Marple had observed managing church accounts for years. Miss Marple had learned to distinguish between the guilt of commission and the guilt of knowledge. Mrs. Fortescue exhibited signs of the latter. She knew something about the crime, possibly suspected the real perpetrator, but her distress seemed rooted in fear rather than remorse. The real killer, Miss Marple suspected, was someone who had carefully positioned Mrs. Fortescue as the obvious suspect, while remaining safely in the shadows. Someone who understood that the best way to avoid detection was to ensure attention focused elsewhere, on a victim whose family history provided convenient motive. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple made her decision. Tomorrow, before Inspector Slack made his arrest, she would have another conversation with Mrs. Fortescue. In her experience, people facing wrongful accusation often found courage to reveal truths they had been too frightened to share. The real solution lay not in the obvious evidence, but in understanding what had driven someone to commit murder, while ensuring another would bear the blame. Miss Marple rose early the next morning with the quiet determination of someone who had spent a restless night organizing troublesome details into a coherent pattern. Inspector Slack's confidence in Mrs. Fortescue's guilt had been built upon seemingly solid evidence, yet something fundamental didn't align with her understanding of both human nature and the practical realities of the crime itself. After a simple breakfast, she made her way to the post office, where Mrs. Baker was sorting the morning mail with her usual methodical precision. The postmistress looked up with the mild curiosity of someone who noticed far more than she typically revealed. "Good morning, Mrs. Baker. I hope I'm not troubling you, but I was wondering about that registered letter you mentioned yesterday, the one for Mr. Finch. Did the postal form record the sender's complete name?" Mrs. Baker brightened with the satisfaction of someone whose attention to detail was finally being appreciated. "As a matter of fact, I still have the counterfoil. We're required to keep them for a fortnight." She rustled through her carefully organized receipts and produced a green slip. "Here we are. Registered post from Seaside Manor, Bournemouth. Sender, Mr. a gudgeon." Miss Marple accepted the slip and read it with the same careful attention she might give to a recipe, though her pulse quickened at the revelation. "A gudgeon," she murmured thoughtfully. "How interesting that the initials should match, yet the name be entirely different from what we all assumed." Returning the slip with thanks, Miss Marple made her way to the church, where the morning light streamed through the ancient windows with that particular quality that made dust motes dance like tiny spirits. The parish chest had been returned to its customary place in the vestry, and she found the Reverend Clement examining the old ledgers with troubled concentration. "Miss Marple, good morning. I've been reviewing the historical records, trying to understand this business with the mysterious letter." He showed her an entry from 1930. A letter was deposited by A.G., witnessed by the verger, a gudgeon. We all assumed A.G. referred to Augustus Greeley. But what if we were wrong? What if A.G. and a gudgeon were the same person, and Albert Gudgeon was confessing to something rather than witnessing someone else's confession? The implications struck Miss Marple immediately. If Albert Gudgeon had been the one making a confession rather than Augustus Greeley, then the entire foundation of the blackmail theory collapsed. Mrs. Fortescue's family shame would be replaced by someone else's vindication, and the motive for murder would shift dramatically. She examined the parish chest, more carefully, her keen eyes noting details that the official investigation had overlooked. On the inner edge of the heavy oak lid, she observed a fresh scratch mark in the old patina, and caught against the iron hinge were two short fibres, red and slightly glossy, consistent with modern ribbon rather than the faded cotton ties that had bound the historical documents. The positioning of the scratch suggested something more deliberate than a simple strangulation. Miss Marple traced the geometry with her eyes, considering the height at which someone would stand, the mechanics of the heavy lid, and the precision required for such a swift, silent crime. This had not been a panicked throttling, but a carefully planned execution using the chest itself as part of the murder weapon. Her next stop was Mrs. Fortescue's cottage, where she found the church treasurer pale but composed, clearly dreading Inspector Slack's promised return. After gentle encouragement, Mrs. Fortescue produced a letter she had received the previous week, also from a gudgeon at Seaside Manor. The letter, written in an elderly but steady hand, contained a confession that turned the entire case on its head. Albert Gudgeon, the former verger, revealed that the mysterious letter in the parish chest contained his own admission of guilt regarding the church building fund irregularities of the 1930s. Augustus Greeley had been wrongly blamed and had left the village in disgrace, while the real culprit had remained, prospering under the cover of his victim's assumed guilt. I received this just after Mr. Gudgeon died, Mrs. Fortescue explained, her voice barely above a whisper. I told Mr. Pemberton about it immediately, begging him to let the vicar read the letter in the chest so my uncle's name could finally be cleared. But he insisted on proper procedures, said these matters were too delicate for the parish fete. Miss Marple studied the letter carefully, noting that the original seal had been broken and clumsily reapplied with fresh red wax. Someone had read this letter and understood its implications, that the opening of the parish chest would expose not Mrs. Fortescue to shame, but someone else entirely. As she walked back through the village, Miss Marple encountered Dr. Haydock making his morning rounds. When she inquired about the specifics of the murder, his response confirmed her growing suspicions. Unusual angle for the ligature marks, he admitted. Not what you'd expect from manual strangulation. More consistent with mechanical pressure, as if something had been used to tighten the ribbon beyond what hands alone could manage. The final piece fell into place when Miss Marple recalled Mr. Pemberton's behaviour during the chest opening. He had been holding a small, ornate letter opener, part of a set of antique writing implements he'd been displaying. Such an instrument, inserted into a ribbon and twisted, would provide exactly the mechanical advantage needed for swift, silent murder. It would also explain the scratch mark on the chest's inner edge, left when the weapon scraped against the wood during the struggle. Arthur Pemberton, the devoted churchwarden who had insisted on displaying the chest, despite Mrs. Fortescue's pleas for discretion. Pemberton, who had the keys, the opportunity, and now, with Albert Gudgeon's posthumous confession, the most compelling motive of all. He was not protecting Mrs. Fortescue from scandal. He was protecting himself from exposure as the real thief who had allowed an innocent man to bear the blame for 30 years. Miss Marple settled into her afternoon chair with her knitting, the pattern now clear in her mind. The murder had been committed not to suppress evidence of Augustus Greeley's guilt, but to prevent the revelation of Albert Gudgeon's confession, a confession that would have exposed the true culprit who had been hiding in plain sight for decades, respected and trusted as the guardian of the very institution he had betrayed. Tomorrow, she decided, she would arrange a conversation that would allow Mr. Pemberton to reveal himself through his own actions. In her experience, guilty consciences often proved their own worst enemies, when given sufficient opportunity to betray themselves. The morning brought with it the kind of crisp clarity that often follows a night of troubled sleep and difficult realizations. Miss Marple had spent the dark hours organizing the fragments Albert Gudgeon's posthumous confession had revealed, and as dawn broke over St. Mary Mead, she understood that the true scandal lay not in what had been discovered, but in what had been carefully hidden for 30 years. Her first visit was to Mrs. Dolly Bantry, whose love of village gossip was matched only by her remarkable memory for local history. Over tea and fresh scones in the morning room at Gossington Hall, Miss Marple gently guided the conversation toward the events of the 1930s, when the church building fund scandal had rocked their peaceful community. Oh, that dreadful business with Augustus Greeley, Mrs. Bantry sighed, settling into her favourite chair with the satisfaction of someone who relished a compelling story. Such a shock when the irregularities came to light. Poor man claimed his innocence to the very end, but the evidence seemed so clear at the time. Though I must say, I never quite believed him capable of such deception. Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully. What made you doubt his guilt? Too honest a man, for one thing. Augustus was weak, certainly, always borrowing trouble along with money, but he lacked the cunning for systematic theft. And there was something else that struck me as odd. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward conspiratorially. Mabel Pemberton appeared at church that winter wearing a magnificent fur stole. Quite new, and very expensive. Everyone noticed because Arthur was so careful with money in those days, and fur stoles don't, simply appear from nowhere. The implication hung delicately in the air. Miss Marple filed this detail alongside her growing understanding of Arthur Pemberton's suspicious prosperity following the scandal. I remember Augustus Greeley's wife, Mrs. Bantry continued, her voice softening with genuine sympathy. Margaret was her name. Such a gentle soul. The scandal destroyed her completely. She died within 2 years of their departure, some said, of a broken heart. They had a daughter, you know, little Jennifer, who went to live with relatives after her mother's death. Miss Marple's understanding deepened. Mrs. Fortescue's distress hadn't been about protecting a guilty family secret, but about the pain of knowing her father had died in disgrace for crimes he hadn't committed. Albert Gudgeon's letter would have been both vindication and tragedy, proof of innocence arriving decades too late to save her parents' lives. The documentary trail. Her next conversation was with Colonel Melchett, whom she found in his study surrounded by old parish newsletters and local historical documents. His military bearing was somewhat diminished by reading spectacles and the scholarly disorder of research materials. Fascinating business, this historical investigation, he greeted her. I've been looking into the old church building project from the 1930s. The funds that went missing were substantial, enough to complete the new bell tower and restore the organ. He showed her a faded photograph from a parish newsletter dated 1929. Here's the building committee. Augustus Greeley as treasurer, Albert Gudgeon as secretary, and young Arthur Pemberton as the architect's assistant. Pemberton was just starting his career then, working for the firm that designed the renovations. Miss Marple studied the photograph with particular interest. 3 young men stood proudly beside architectural drawings, their faces bright with shared enthusiasm. It was a poignant reminder that the seeds of future tragedy often lay buried in moments of innocent collaboration. Pemberton never spoke much about those early days, the colonel continued, always claimed the scandal had been too painful for the community to revisit, but he was the one who suggested Gudgeon for the verger position when old Matthews retired. They'd worked closely together on the building project. The pattern was becoming clearer. Arthur Pemberton had not only known Albert Gudgeon well enough to recommend him for a position of trust, but had been intimately involved in the very project from which funds had been stolen. His architectural knowledge would have given him detailed understanding of building costs, making it easier to manipulate accounts without detection. Village memories. Miss Marple's afternoon visit to Mrs. Price Ridley proved equally illuminating. She found her in the drawing room, meticulously polishing silver with the precision of someone who believed proper maintenance reflected moral character. Such a dreadful affair, Mrs. Price Ridley began before Miss Marple had even settled into her chair, though I always said there was something rather too convenient about how quickly the church funds were mysteriously replenished after poor Augustus disappeared. Arthur Pemberton worked tirelessly to put things right, of course. Quite the young man then, very ambitious. Miss Marple allowed the observation to settle before responding. Mr. Pemberton certainly did well for himself. His family wasn't always as established as they are now, I believe. Oh, quite right. His father was a modest farmer, but Arthur had ambition and a good head for figures. Built that lovely house by the stream, invested wisely, became churchwarden before he was 40. a true success story, rising from humble beginnings. Mrs. Price Ridley's tone carried the satisfaction of someone who appreciated social advancement achieved through proper channels. The true picture emerges. As evening approached, Miss Marple walked through the churchyard, her mind organising the day's revelations into a coherent pattern. The murder of Gerald Finch was not merely about preventing the exposure of an old scandal, it was about protecting an entire life built upon deception. Arthur Pemberton's sudden prosperity had coincided suspiciously with the church fund theft, and Augustus Greeley's convenient disgrace. The mysteriously replenished funds were no mystery to Miss Marple. They represented Pemberton's careful replacement of a portion of what he'd stolen, allowing him to appear as the church's saviour, while keeping the bulk for his own advancement. Gerald Finch had not been a casual antique dealer, stumbling upon interesting historical artefacts. Albert Gudgeon's final letters had likely hired him to investigate the truth, perhaps even to retrieve the confession from the Parish Chest. Finch, realizing the potential value of such information, had begun his careful inquiries in St. Mary Mead, pressing those he suspected of involvement. The registered letter from Gudgeon, mentioned by Mrs. Baker, was almost certainly the dying man's final attempt to ensure justice, providing Finch with the key information needed to understand the confession in the chest. But Pemberton, seeing Finch's intense interest at the fete and realizing his 30-year secret was about to be exposed, had acted with desperate efficiency. As she reached her cottage gate, Miss Marple reflected on the complex web of guilt, fear, and calculated silence that had led to murder. Tomorrow, she would need to arrange for the truth to emerge in a way that would satisfy both justice and Inspector Slack's requirements for proof. The forgotten letter in the Parish Chest had cast a very long shadow indeed, and it was time for that shadow to finally lift from St. Mary Mead, the early morning calm of St. Mary Mead was shattered by Mrs. Price Ridley's piercing cry, which carried across the village green with the authority of genuine alarm. Miss Marple, already awake and tending to her morning roses, heard the distress in that voice, and made her way quickly toward Mrs. Fortescue's cottage, where a small crowd was beginning to gather. She arrived to find Inspector Slack emerging from the cottage with the grim satisfaction of someone whose theories had been dramatically confirmed. Dr. Haydock followed, carrying his medical bag and wearing the expression of a man who had narrowly prevented a tragedy. "Attempted suicide," Slack announced to the assembled villagers. Mrs. Fortescue took an overdose of sleeping tablets sometime during the night, left a full confession to Finch's murder. If Mr. Pemberton hadn't found her when he did, we'd be dealing with another death. Miss Marple observed the scene with her characteristic attention to detail. Arthur Pemberton stood near the cottage door, his face appropriately grave as he spoke quietly with the Reverend Clement. His hands, she noted, were remarkably steady for someone who had just discovered a parishioner's suicide attempt. "Mr. Pemberton," she addressed him gently, "it must have been a terrible shock for you." "Dreadful," he replied, though his voice carried more resignation than horror. "I'd arranged to collect some church documents from her this morning. When she didn't answer my knock, I used my key. As church warden, I have keys to several parishioners' homes for emergencies. I found her unconscious in the kitchen." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically while noting the precision of his explanation. The arrangement to collect documents was convenient, providing legitimate reason for his presence, yet she wondered why such business couldn't have been conducted at the church office as was customary. Inspector Slack produced a single sheet of paper with evident satisfaction. "Here's her confession, admits to killing Finch to protect her family's honour, says she couldn't live with the guilt, clear as daylight." Miss Marple examined the handwriting with the same careful attention she might give to a complex knitting pattern. While the script was recognisably Mrs. Fortescue's, there were subtle differences, a slight tremor in certain letters, an uncharacteristic brevity that seemed at odds with the woman's naturally detailed communication style. "How curious," she murmured. "Mrs. Fortescue always signs her church correspondence with her full name, Jennifer Mary Fortescue. She's quite particular about such formalities." Dr. Haydock, overhearing, looked up from securing his medical bag. "She's stable now, but it was close." The dosage was calculated to be dangerous but not necessarily fatal, almost as if someone wanted her found in time. Miss Marple's keen eyes took in other details that the official investigation had overlooked. The cottage's kitchen window stood slightly ajar despite the morning's chill, and fresh mud streaked the interior sill. Curious, since Mrs. Fortescue was known for her meticulous housekeeping. On the kitchen table, alongside the empty bottle of sleeping tablets, lay several church financial documents that appeared to have been hastily scattered. More significantly, she noticed that Mrs. Fortescue's sewing basket had been disturbed, its contents partially spilled across the floor. Among the scattered items was a length of red ribbon, similar to those that had bound the old documents in the parish chest, with one end showing signs of recent fraying. "Inspector," she said quietly, "might I ask what time, mister?" Pemberton discovered Mrs. Fortescue. "Just after 7 this morning," Slack replied. Said he'd been concerned about her state of mind since yesterday's questioning and wanted to check on her before the morning service. Miss Marple reflected on this timing. Mrs. Baker at the post office had mentioned seeing lights in Mrs. Fortescue's cottage as late as 11 the previous evening, when the woman was preparing her weekly correspondence. The suicide attempt would have occurred sometime between then and dawn, yet the cottage showed no signs of the prolonged distress typically associated with such desperate acts. As the morning progressed and Mrs. Fortescue was transported to the hospital in Much Benham, Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by the convenient resolution this apparent suicide provided. Inspector Slack's satisfaction was understandable but premature. In her experience, guilty parties rarely provided such neat conclusions to their crimes. Her suspicions deepened when she learned from Mrs. Baker that Arthur Pemberton had visited the village shop the previous afternoon, purchasing items that included a bottle of strong sleeping tablets, unusual, since his wife typically handled such domestic purchases. He had specifically inquired about dosages, claiming concern for his own recent insomnia. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to Mrs. Fortescue's cottage, now empty and sealed by police tape. Through careful observation of the exterior, she noted several telling details. The kitchen window's catch showed fresh scratches, suggesting it had been forced from outside. The flower bed beneath contained footprints that were too large for Mrs. Fortescue's feet, and the pattern suggested someone had approached and departed by this route, rather than using the front door. Most significantly, she discovered in the garden a small brass fitting that had fallen into the rose bushes, the type used to secure the handle of a decorative letter opener. It was tarnished and showed recent stress marks, as if it had been twisted or used for purposes beyond its design. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat in her garden reviewing the day's discoveries. The attempted suicide was not the desperate act of a guilty conscience, but a calculated move by the real murderer to eliminate the investigation's most dangerous witness. Mrs. Fortescue, who had received Albert Gudgeon's confession and understood the true significance of the letter in the parish chest, represented the greatest threat to the killer's 30-year deception. The attempt had been carefully staged to appear self-inflicted, while ensuring discovery in time to prevent actual death. The forged confession note would serve as apparent proof of guilt, allowing the real killer to escape justice, while the victim bore blame for both the historical theft and Gerald Finch's murder. Arthur Pemberton's convenient discovery of the scene, his access to Mrs. Fortescue's cottage, and his recent purchase of sleeping tablets all pointed to calculated intervention rather than pastoral coincidence. The physical evidence, the forced window, the scattered documents, the planted ribbon, suggested a hurried staging designed to support the suicide narrative while destroying remaining evidence. Miss Marple set aside her knitting with quiet determination. The real killer had revealed himself through his very attempt to eliminate the witness who could expose him. Tomorrow she would ensure that Mrs. Fortescue survived to tell her story, and that Arthur Pemberton's carefully constructed deception finally crumbled under the weight of truth. The forgotten letter in the parish chest had claimed one life already. She would not allow it to claim another. The morning brought word from Dr. Haydock that Mrs. Fortescue was conscious and recovering well at the hospital in Much Benham, though she remained confused about the events surrounding her collapse. Miss Marple received this news with quiet satisfaction, understanding that the woman's survival meant the truth could still emerge despite the killer's desperate attempt to silence her. Miss Marple had spent the night devising a careful plan to expose Arthur Pemberton through his own reactions. In her long experience, murderers who believed themselves secure often revealed themselves when confronted with unexpected challenges to their carefully constructed narratives. She would need to create such a challenge while ensuring reliable witnesses were present. Her opportunity came when she suggested to the Reverend Clement that a small gathering might be appropriate to discuss support for Mrs. Fortescue during her recovery. "Perhaps in the vestry," she proposed gently, "where we might also ensure the parish chest is properly secured after all these disturbances. Mr. Pemberton's expertise would be invaluable." The subtle arrangement. By afternoon, Miss Marple had assembled her careful cast, the Reverend Clement, Colonel Melchett, and Arthur Pemberton, with Inspector Slack positioned discreetly in the side chapel, where he could observe without being obvious. The vestry's ancient atmosphere, with its scent of beeswax and old paper, provided the perfect setting for her psychological experiment. The parish chest sat in its customary place, and Miss Marple had arranged several items on the nearby table with apparent casualness: a length of red ribbon similar to those found in the chest, a stick of sealing wax, and, most significantly, a letter opener with a freshly replaced brass ferrule, polished to gleaming perfection. "Such a relief that Mrs. Fortescue is recovering," Miss Marple began conversationally, as Pemberton examined the chest contents with professional attention. "Dr. Haydock mentioned she's been asking about the church documents. Apparently, she's quite eager to discuss Mr. Gudgeon's letter with Inspector Slack." She observed Pemberton's hands pause almost imperceptibly in their work. Of course, the poor dear may still be confused about some details. Though she was remarkably clear about receiving additional documentation from Mr. Gudgeon before his death. Copies, she mentioned, kept for safety. The psychological pressure. Pemberton's usual composure showed the first hairline crack. "I'm sure Mrs. Fortescue's memory will improve with rest," he replied carefully. "Trauma can affect recollection in curious ways." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, her knitting needles clicking gently. "Though it's remarkable how certain physical evidence remains constant despite emotional distress. That brass fitting we found in her rose garden, for instance, such an unusual thing to discover. Inspector Slack was quite interested in how it matched the scratches on this chest's interior." She gestured toward the parish chest, and Pemberton's gaze followed involuntarily. His eyes lingered on the fresh scratch marks in the ancient wood, and Miss Marple noted how his expression shifted from casual interest to something approaching recognition. "Mr. Pemberton," she continued with gentle persistence, "you mentioned yesterday that Mrs. Fortescue seemed distressed about family matters. Did she share any specifics about her uncle's situation? The historical records, I mean." "Nothing of consequence," he replied, but his voice carried a slight strain. "Old family shame, as I understood it." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. How curious, then, that Mr. Gudgeon's confession should reverse that shame entirely. According to Mrs. Fortescue, the letter quite clearly identifies the real culprit in the church fund irregularities, someone who allowed Augustus Greeley to bear false blame for 30 years. The crucial test. The effect was immediate and telling. Pemberton's hands stilled completely on the ribbon he had been examining, and his knuckles whitened with tension. "Deathbed confessions are notoriously unreliable," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "The elderly often confuse guilt and responsibility." "True," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully, though Mr. Gudgeon was remarkably specific about dates, amounts, and methods. Mrs. Fortescue mentioned he even described how someone with architectural knowledge might disguise theft as legitimate building expenses. She picked up the letter opener from the table, examining it with apparent innocent interest. "Such a useful tool, don't you think? The brass fitting was quite loose when we found it, almost as if it had been used for purposes beyond its design. Twisted, perhaps, to provide leverage." Pemberton's reaction was swift and involuntary. His gaze snapped to the letter opener, then to the ribbon in his hands, and finally to the scratch marks on the chest. For just a moment, his face revealed the calculation of someone remembering exactly how those marks had been made. "I wouldn't know about such things," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Miss Marple's gentle smile never wavered. "Of course not. Though I imagine someone with your practical experience might understand how such tools could be repurposed in moments of desperation." The silence that followed was profound, In it, Miss Marple observed the final collapse of Arthur Pemberton's carefully maintained facade. His shoulders sagged slightly, his breathing became shallow, and his eyes held the trapped look of someone who understood that 30 years of deception were finally unravelling. The psychological test was complete, and the results were unmistakable to everyone present. Inspector Slack stepped from the side chapel at Miss Marple's subtle signal, his expression alert and purposeful. The vestry seemed to hold its breath, dust motes suspended in the afternoon light as Arthur Pemberton stood frozen beside the parish chest, his composure finally beginning to crack under the weight of 30 years of carefully guarded secrets. "I believe," Miss Marple said gently, setting aside her knitting, "it would help everyone if we examined exactly what happened, both 30 years ago and 2 days past." Her blue eyes moved deliberately from the Reverend Clement to Colonel Melchett, finally settling on Pemberton, whose hands trembled almost imperceptibly as they gripped the edge of the ancient chest. "The historical deception. The letter we discovered bore the initials A.G., and we all assumed this referred to Augustus Greeley. We were both right and wrong. The registered letter that arrived for Mr. Finch last week was indeed from someone with those initials, Albert Gudgeon, the former verger, writing from his deathbed at Seaside Manor in Bournemouth." Miss Marple moved closer to the chest, her voice carrying the quiet authority of absolute certainty. "Mr. Gudgeon's letter contained a confession, but not the one we expected. He admitted to stealing from the church building fund in the 1930s, and more importantly, he named his accomplice, the young architect's assistant who provided the technical knowledge to disguise theft as legitimate building expenses." She turned to face Pemberton directly. "That accomplice was you, Mr. Pemberton. You were the one who taught Albert Gudgeon how to manipulate the accounts, how to make stolen money appear as cost overruns and design modifications. When the irregularities were discovered, you both allowed Augustus Greeley to bear the blame. His signature was on the documents you had prepared, making him the perfect scapegoat." Pemberton's breathing had become audibly shallow, but he remained silent, his eyes fixed on the letter opener that lay gleaming on the table. The funds that mysteriously appeared to help restore the church building came from you, a careful replacement of a portion of what you'd stolen, making you appear as the parish's saviour, while keeping the bulk for your own advancement. Your fine house, your rise to churchwarden, your entire respectable life, all built on theft and an innocent man's destroyed reputation. The murder method. Gerald Finch came to Saint. Mary Mead armed with Albert Gudgeon's information. He wasn't merely an antique dealer, he was an investigator hired to retrieve the original confession from this chest and clear Augustus Greeley's name. When the parish fete provided the opportunity to examine the chest's contents, you realized your danger immediately. Miss Marple picked up the letter opener, examining its polished surface. The murder itself was brilliantly planned but hastily executed. You used this letter opener, part of your own antique writing set, not as a simple weapon, but as a mechanical advantage. You looped one of the document ribbons around Mr. Finch's neck, inserted the letter opener's handle, and twisted it like a tourniquet, using the chest's heavy edge as a fulcrum for leverage. Dr. Haydock, who had arrived during the explanation, nodded grimly. The ligature marks were too precise for manual strangulation. The mechanical pressure explains the evenness of the injury. The fresh scratch on the chest's inner edge shows exactly where your letter opener scraped during the struggle. The brass ferrule broke off during the process, the same ferrule we found in Mrs. Fortescue's garden, where you dropped it while staging your second crime. The desperate cover-up. When Inspector Slack quite reasonably focused on Mrs. Fortescue as a suspect due to her family connection, you saw your opportunity to eliminate the one person who possessed copies of Gudgeon's confession. You purchased sleeping tablets, broke into her cottage through the kitchen window, and forced them down her throat. Then you scattered church documents to suggest guilt-driven suicide and planted a forged confession note. Miss Marple's voice hardened slightly. But you made critical errors. Mrs. Fortescue always signs her full name on formal documents. She would never have written simply Jennifer on such a note. The forced window, the muddy footprints in her garden, the timing of your convenient discovery, all pointed to your involvement rather than her desperation. The physical evidence. Inspector Slack consulted his notebook. We have the registered postal slip confirming Gudgeon's letter to Finch. We have Mrs. Fortescue's copy of the confession naming you specifically. We have the brass ferrule from your letter opener, the scratches on the chest that match its dimensions, and your purchase of the sleeping tablets used in the staged suicide. Miss Marple added quietly, "And we have your reactions today, Mr. Pemberton. When I mentioned the brass fitting and the mechanical leverage, you looked directly at the scratch marks on the chest, exactly where you remembered scraping the letter opener during the murder." The silence stretched unbearably until Arthur Pemberton finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I built a good life. I served this church faithfully for decades. One mistake from my youth shouldn't destroy everything I accomplished." "But it wasn't one mistake," Miss Marple replied with gentle firmness. "It was 30 years of allowing an innocent man to bear your guilt, letting his family suffer in disgrace while you prospered. And finally, it was murder to protect your deception." Inspector Slack stepped forward with his handcuffs. "Arthur Pemberton, I'm arresting you for the murder of Gerald Finch and the attempted murder of Jennifer Fortescue." As they led him away, Pemberton's carefully maintained facade crumbled completely. The forgotten letter in the parish chest had finally yielded its truth, 30 years too late for Augustus Greeley, but just in time to prevent another innocent person from bearing the weight of a guilty man's crimes. The ancient vestry settled back into its accustomed peace, though the shadows seemed somehow lighter, as if a long-carried burden had finally been lifted from the very stones themselves. The days following Arthur Pemberton's arrest brought to St. Mary Mead the peculiar quiet that settles over a community when its deepest assumptions have been overturned. The village continued its familiar rhythms, yet everything felt subtly altered, as if the very foundations had shifted beneath their feet. Miss Marple observed these changes from her garden chair, her knitting needles moving with practiced rhythm, while her keen eyes noted how truth, however painful, ultimately proved more healing than the most comfortable deception. The village adjusts. The immediate shock rippled through every cottage and shop with the force of genuine disbelief. Mrs. Price Ridley, whose pronouncements usually carried such authority, found herself uncharacteristically subdued. "To think he walked among us all these years," she murmured to Mrs. Bantry, "serving on committees, leading prayers, all while harbouring such secrets. The implications of such profound deception struck at the heart of their small community's sense of security." Colonel Melchett stepped into the churchwarden role with military efficiency, tempered by genuine humility. "We must rebuild trust carefully," he told the Reverend Clement during their first meeting. "The church's reputation depends not on hiding from this scandal, but on how we address it honestly." The beautiful house by the stream stood empty, now its carefully tended gardens already showing signs of neglect. Legal proceedings would determine the fate of assets built on decades of theft, but the village had already rendered its own judgment. Pemberton's name would be remembered not for his apparent devotion, but for the lives he had destroyed in service of his own ambition. Mrs. Fortescue's vindication. When Mrs. Jennifer Fortescue returned from the hospital, pale but resolute, she found a community transformed in its attitude toward her. The woman they had been prepared to condemn as a murderer was now recognized as the victim of a cruel injustice that had spanned 2 generations. Miss Marple visited her on a crisp October morning, bringing tea and gentle companionship to the cottage that had so recently been the scene of attempted murder. "I keep thinking about my parents," Mrs. Fortescue confided, her hands wrapped around the warm cup. "Father died believing no one would ever accept his innocence. Mother's heart broke from the shame of it all." "But now his name is cleared," Miss Marple replied softly. "The Church Council has voted unanimously to restore his reputation. The memorial plaque they're planning will ensure Augustus Greeley is remembered as he truly was, an honest man wrongly accused." The younger woman's eyes filled with tears of relief rather than sorrow. Albert Gudgeon's posthumous confession had explained everything: how Pemberton had manipulated the accounts, convinced the verger to participate, and then allowed an innocent man to bear the blame when discovery threatened. The truth had come 30 years too late to save her parents, but it had finally arrived. The church's healing. The Reverend Clement struggled most with the betrayal, having trusted Pemberton not only with church affairs but with pastoral confidences. Miss Marple found him one afternoon in the vestry, sitting quietly beside the parish chest that had held its terrible secret for so long. "I keep wondering if I should have seen something," he admitted. "Some sign that he was living such an elaborate lie." "Guilt can be a masterful actor," Miss Marple replied gently. "Arthur Pemberton had 30 years to perfect his performance. He convinced himself, I suspect, that his good work somehow balanced his earlier crimes. Self-deception is often more complete than the deception of others." The vicar found comfort in this perspective, gradually returning to his natural optimism as the parish rallied around the truth. The historical display was reinstated with proper tribute to Augustus Greeley, while Albert Gudgeon's confession was preserved as a testament to the power of conscience, however delayed. Reflections on human nature. As autumn deepened and the last leaves fell from her apple tree, Miss Marple often contemplated the complex motivations that had led to such tragedy. Gerald Finch had died seeking justice for a wronged man. Arthur Pemberton had destroyed himself through increasingly desperate attempts to protect a lie that had grown beyond his control. The irony was not lost on her that Pemberton's greatest fear, exposure of his youthful crime, would likely have resulted in far less severe consequences than the murder he committed to prevent it. A confession accompanied by decades of genuine service might have found forgiveness. Instead, his inability to face the truth had led to the very destruction he sought to avoid. Inspector Slack, making a final visit to discuss the case's resolution, remained puzzled by her deductive process. "I still don't understand how you knew Mrs. Fortescue was innocent," he admitted. Miss Marple smiled with patient understanding. "Evidence can be manufactured, Inspector, but character cannot. Mrs. Fortescue's nature was consistent with someone protecting a family secret, not with someone capable of cold-blooded murder. Arthur Pemberton's character, once properly understood, was entirely consistent with someone who would kill to protect 30 years of carefully constructed respectability." The enduring truth. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead and Inspector Slack departed, Miss Marple reflected on the curious comfort she found in understanding human nature so clearly. People were endlessly complex, capable of both remarkable goodness and shocking evil, often within the same heart. But patterns emerged for those patient enough to observe, and truth had a persistent way of surfacing despite the most careful attempts to bury it. The forgotten letter in the parish chest had finally delivered its message, not just about past crimes, but about the enduring power of conscience and the ultimate futility of building a life upon deception. The chest itself had been transformed from a repository of hidden guilt into a symbol of truth finally revealed. Her knitting needles clicked peacefully in the gathering dusk, marking time in a village that had learned once again that beneath the most tranquil surfaces, the deepest currents of human nature continued to flow. St. Mary Mead would remember this lesson long after the immediate shock had faded into local history, understanding that the greatest mysteries often lay not in external puzzles, but in the complex depths of human character and motivation. The parish bells chimed the evening hour, their familiar sound carrying across a community forever changed by the revelation that truth, however long buried, will eventually find its way to light.